way of thinking about Romanticism is as a reaction against some of the ideas and emphases of the Enlightenment. So, Enlightenment thinkers valued reason above all else. It was the faculty that was distinctively human, the most important aspect of human nature. Romantic thinkers in reaction said, wait, no. There's more to being human than rationality. There's emotion, there's imagination as well. So Romanticism emphasizes emotion and imagination. Similarly, while the Enlightenment emphasized the rational, Romanticism emphasized the irrational. That can mean the emotional, but can also mean the supernatural, the things that cannot be explained by reason. Because the Enlightenment celebrated human progress and technology, they also celebrated culture. They thought that becoming cultured and educated and civilized improved human beings, made them better. In contrast, the Romantics saw nature as inherently good and human civilization as corrupting that essential goodness. So, while the Enlightenment valued educated, cultured people, Romanticism valued uncivilized people. The uneducated farmer, the child, even the mentally retarded. These people were closer to nature and less corrupted by civilization. Similarly, if you had asked a man of the Enlightenment, where is the best place in the world to live? He would have said, well, the city, of course. That's where educated people are. That's where new ideas develop. That's where human civilization is most fully realized. Equally, if you asked a Romantic, he would have said, well, the country, of course. That's where you can get closer to nature and therefore closer to truth and to goodness. While the Enlightenment emphasized what human beings all have in common, their reason, and believed that there was a universal human nature, the Romantics often emphasized what makes us particularly individuals, our different experiences, our different cultures. The Enlightenment thinker was likely to think of himself as a citizen of the world. But the Romantics emphasized the cultures of individual nations and individual people, and they promoted nationalism. Finally, the Enlightenment thinker valued society and social life, the life of a social and civilized man, while the Romantic valued the individual and solitude, preferably solitude in nature. Now, these different worldviews produced very different literature. Enlightenment literature took up public social topics and often used satire to promote reform of society, which was a central value of the Enlightenment. The point of view was objective, in keeping with the idea of a universal human nature. The poet is expressing not only his own point of view, he's speaking to some extent as the voice of society, or even as the voice of all humanity. Alexander Pope, a great Enlightenment poet, wrote, "True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed." That is, we all have the same thought, but the poet expresses it better than the rest of us. Here, the idea is for the poet to imitate nature, at least the way the Enlightenment thought about nature, and produce mimetic art, imitative art, mimetic art. Romantic literature, though, is different. Here, the poet is a unique individual having unique experiences, which he expresses through his poetry. Poetry is not an objective, mimetic imitation of nature, but the expression of a subjective experience that the poet has. This subjective experience is most often expressed through lyric poetry. That is, a short poem that expresses personal emotions or perceptions and is typically written in the first person. So it's typically written as I. There are more important contrasts. Enlightenment poets were more likely to use traditional forms in their poetry, while the Romantics liked to experiment with new forms and meters. The Enlightenment poets often wrote about classical subjects, Greek and Roman mythology and culture. In fact, the literary period of the English Enlightenment is often called the Augustan Age because the writers identified with the high culture of Rome during the age of Augustus. Romantics, however, more often wrote about folk tales or stories from the Middle Ages, which they thought of as less highly civilized and therefore as closer to nature. Finally, Enlightenment thinkers and Romantics had different ideas of the artist or the poet. For the Enlightenment, the artist was a craftsman who learned how to paint or to write verse, who practiced, who got really good at it. He or she probably had some natural talent for the work, but basically, an artist was made, not born. For the Romantics, however, an artist or poet had to be born and not made. The artist was a kind of original genius with special powers of perception and special powers of imagination, as well as a way with words or with paint or music. He was a man closer to nature, and he could become a kind of prophet or seer. We will see these versions of the poet as close to nature as a prophet as we look at the first generation of Romantic poets next week. But while it's useful to contrast Romantic ideas with Enlightenment ideas, some central ideas were shared by both movements. They both emphasized the importance of the individual. They were both opposed to the status quo. They had different ideas, though, about how change ought to take place. The Enlightenment thinkers supported reforming society over time, while the Romantics tended to favor revolution, immediate and complete change. Finally, the Romantics inherited from the Enlightenment that central value of human liberty, personal and political, which you will see reflected in their poetry over the next 2 weeks.